A lot of people are very worked up over whether AI is going to replace jobs. My guests today think that we should calm down about it. One, because AI just isn't there yet. And two, because it's not written in the stars how AI is going to impact our jobs. A lot has to do with the values that we decide to build and implement AI with. Those two guests, one is Kate Vredenburgh. She's associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the London School of Economics, and her colleague and friend, Lauren Wong. She works at Meta in commercial virtual reality, although to be clear, the views that she expresses are her own and not necessarily those of her employer. We talk about a bunch of things, a few main points to highlight. One of them is that a lot of the fear of widespread job loss due to widespread AI adoption is just faulty extrapolation, that we see that it's good at one thing, like it's good at passing the bar, and then we go with, oh my God, no more lawyers. Or it's good at recognizing broken bones and x-rays. And we think, okay, radiologists are out of a job. But there's so many steps between passing a test, being good at identifying broken bones, and being able to replace wholesale someone's job. So a lot of that just isn't there. And we need to know, they think, what the steps are from it's good at this test to it's going to replace jobs. A lot of the contingent things that occur that we need to think about more carefully is, what does organizational redesign look like? What does worker adoption require? What kind of training do people need? What kind of incentives do people need in order to adopt this technology? And absent that sort of broader picture, we don't see a clear path to getting to people getting replaced by AI. We saw this earlier when we're talking about AI replacing humans wholesale, as in replacing humanity. And one of the things that I pushed for there is there seems to be a lot of steps that I want to know the probabilities for. And it's the same kind of structural conversation that we have when we're talking about AI replacing humans. There are a couple of points of disagreement or a couple of places where I push back. So for instance, there's a lot of talk about the extent to which we should compare AI to virtual reality or the metaverse. Why did the metaverse ultimately fail, not come to fruition? Are there patterns that we can see there that also apply to AI? Lauren thinks yes. I think maybe not. I'm not sure. And there's also a question about how should we interpret the lack of widespread adoption of AI? Is it because the technology is not there? Is it because the right kinds of organizational redesign, training, incentives, et cetera, hasn't been introduced yet? A little bit of conversation about that. Okay, that's what this conversation is about. Separately, you might know that I have a book coming out April 21st, 2026. It is called The Ethical Nightmare Challenge. It's available or will be available Amazon, Barnes & Noble, blah, 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 blah. And if you want to learn more about that book, you want to hear about events that I'm going to do around the book, Q&A sessions, talks, keynotes I'm giving around it, more information about when it's launching or how it's launching, where it's launching, blah, 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 go to readblackman.substack.com and subscribe there. And you can also email me with questions, comments, criticisms, etc. at em@readblackman.com. Okay, that's enough about my stuff. Let's go talk to Kate and Lauren. Okay, so Kate and Lauren, here's how I understand your sort of respective but also aggregate views. It's something like, look, there's two good reasons to calm down about job displacement by AI. The first is that, look, it's not going to do it. The technology is not there. And the second is something like, even if it could, it's not as though we can't do anything about it. We can shape that technology in such a way that we don't lose the jobs. So, right, is that the view? Do I have that right?
Absolutely. So I think there are a few things here, right? People tend to start off with like technological capabilities. What can our technology actually do for us? How can we test its capabilities? And then they just stop there and they're like, okay, this technology has amazing capabilities. And we jump to some kind of macro conclusion, like, therefore, it's likely to replace all of us.
It passed the bar, so it's going to replace all the lawyers.
Exactly. And there are a lot of steps between meeting some benchmark that we set in order to test the technology's capacities and putting us all out of work. And I think what we're both interested in is, what are the different steps that need to happen in order for us to get some kind of positive result with these technologies? And then in particular, as a philosopher, I'm interested in, what are the kind of values that we need to bring to bear in order to actually get us there?
All right, let's talk about the values in a moment. First, I want to talk about the technological capacity to replace jobs. And it sounds Lauren, especially, that you're interested in and have a deep understanding of the probability of such a thing. One thing that goes on, I think, in the space is we think something is possible, or data scientists proclaim something is possible, and then they forget that there's varying degrees of probability all of a sudden. And so if it's possible, it's inevitable all of a sudden. There's a probability of one. How did that happen? But yeah, tell me about the extent to which we should think that AI replacing people and their jobs is probable.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. I do think that there is quite a fallacy around looking at very specific use cases and examples of replacement as an example, and then assuming that because you see that happening in a couple of places, that then applies to every workflow and every job function across every industry, right? There's a lot of disparity across those different types of work that has to be done. And so it's quite a leap to take one and extrapolate all the way to the kind of this future of total displacement. And I think if we think about VR as an example, we had this vision of kind of the future of work with VR that was heralded around, okay, everyone's going to be working in a metaverse. You'll be able to seamlessly go from physical to virtual environments. You're going to have much deeper collaboration. You're going to have massive productivity gains. And what we've seen actually is, yes, there is some traction for VR in enterprise, but that's really very niche. And it's around things like learning and development. It's around things like 3D design. And so you could look at it and say, okay, there's some success here. And therefore, we can extrapolate that out to a future of work in VR. And you absolutely cannot, right? We've seen that this metaverse didn't materialize. So I would just caution us to do that extrapolation from one to the other.
And maybe just to jump in here, I think this example is so helpful because we're a couple of years behind the development of AR, VR in ways that we can learn a lot, for example, about the speculation about Gen AI in the workplace. So exact same thing, right? We've seen Gen AI be recently enormously successful in one particular domain, coding. I think there's still a real question of to what extent, right, coders are going to be replaced, but we have seen enormous success. And then people just go off vibes. So it's okay. Therefore, this can probably do a bunch of other tasks. And so we should expect to see a replacement across any kind of cognitive work. And rather than vibes, right, we need, for particular concrete tasks, use cases, benchmarks to test it against those tasks. And then also to think about all of the things that Lauren has actually worked with AR, VR, which is, okay, not just what domains could it be successful in, but how do we actually get it there, and how can organizations and people actually use or not use these technologies successfully? And I think that's a kind of step that is easy for people building the technology or engineers to forget about, that ultimately people need to use this and people have all kinds of like constraints, organizational incentives. And if you totally abstract from those, it's just not going to work.
Yeah, I find it remarkable how data scientists are so divorced from the scientific methodology of things like forming hypotheses, gathering evidence, seeking disconforming evidence. Like I see so many times, that it's so smart. And then there's this massive extrapolation move to we're all doomed. Even in the sort of the doomer, forget about job replacement, the sort of humanities replacement, the species, not humanities, like humanity, species replacement by AI. It's always this. It's possible that they'll endlessly iterate on themselves, become infinitely intelligent, and then they'll have no need for us. And then we'll be dead. And that's inevitable. So I don't know. It feels like maybe you're missing some steps. Maybe you should assign probabilities to each of those steps, but it just flies off to the world of total fanciful. And it seems like the same thing with job stuff. Can you say more, Lauren, about, I don't know, some of the mistakes that people made when they were talking about VR? Because obviously I'm familiar with all the talk of the metaverse and how people are going crazy about it. And it was that it's the next wave and future of work is the metaverse and blah, 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 blah. What was going on? Everyone thought that was the case. I'm proud to say I always thought it was bullshit and I never got into that whole thing. And do you see the same thing as happening here? Do you see the pattern repeating do you see a pattern emerging between that and this?
Yeah, I definitely see a pattern. I think that technology companies oftentimes make the mistake of believing that a technology sells itself, right? And that just because you have a good technology means that it will be adopted. They build it and they will come, a frame of mind. And there were several challenges with VR, I think, that made it particularly difficult for enterprises to adopt. But these are challenges that aren't specific to VR. You have challenges for VR, things like, okay, yes, by nature of it being attached to a headset, something that's a physical product, you've got inventory and device management challenges, you've got comfort and fit and ergonomics challenges, you've got content development challenges. So that aside,
Cost.
cost, exactly. So the specifics of VR aside, I think there are some fundamentals that are barriers to adoption for any new technology that enterprises are going to be experiencing. And I think where VR really struggled was to address those barriers properly. And that's where we're also starting to see AI make some of the same mistakes. So things that fall into these buckets are things like having a clear problem that you're trying to solve. It's not about, here's a model, here are all the capabilities, and just imagine the potential or just think about what you could do with this. Instead, and what VR made the mistake of doing was that there wasn't a really clear problem that VR was solving for businesses. There was no high value problem that businesses could look at and say, yes, I need this to be fixed. And in so doing, it's going to save me money or time or resources, or it's going to increase my revenue, right? Or reduce risk or something like that. And so really needing to lead with a clear problem that's being solved and a clear ROI was something that in those niche cases that I talked about around learning and training and 3D design, those are seeing some stickiness because the ROI and the problem solved is clear. I think where we didn't see so much traction was around these ideas of better collaboration or stronger productivity. These are things that are fuzzy and not necessarily a problem that a business is trying to solve on a day-to-day basis. I think that is one key area of know very specifically the operational problem that you are trying to solve with this technology, and don't just sell the technology and the innovation in and of itself. There are other things too, certainly like the human side of tech deployment, I think is something that is so often forgotten about, and companies will...
What do you mean by that? What does that mean to forget the human side?
Yeah, I think companies, once they've decided they want to pilot something, they put aside the budget for the hardware in VR's case and the software and maybe the content, right? But the softer side of an implementation around, do you have actual leadership buy-in, stakeholder management? Are you thinking about training your employees? Are you factoring in a redesign of people's workflows? Are you thinking about having to continually reinforce these learnings such that it's not like somebody just picks this up and tries it one time because you trained them yesterday and then they forget all about it? So it really all falls under this very unsexy title of change management, right? But these are things that are absolutely essential to getting businesses to adopt a new technology. And effectively, enterprises are run by people, and people are resistant to change. And so unless you are very thoughtful about how you operate within that type of environment and really ensure that kind of adoption of technology is really shepherded along, you will see these pilots fail and you will see scale deployment not occur.
And just to...
It sounds a little bit, sorry, but it sounds like a little bit like you just said the problem to be solved. It's humans working at these corporations. You got to get rid of the humans and change management is much easier. It's literally the press of a button. I'm only half joking. I'm mostly joking, I think. I don't know. I'm not sure my level of joking there. But let me take the AI optimist stance for a second and say why, it's weird with VR. We couldn't find the problems that we solve it with AI. It's more obvious. And so your claim that this is just like VR again is not right. Let me push this line. It is. Yeah. Okay. So VR, yes, very hard to see. We know why the hell do we need to get into the metaverse in order to share a document and talk about it? Okay. So it's hard to see the obvious ROI. But with AI, here's some problems that it solves. People tend to be slow. Decisions can move faster. Lots of things can be automated. The more efficiently we operate, the more money we save. So the more money we make. One of the things that needs to get done is people have to pour through tons of text documents or just tons of documents in general. Document handling in general is a lengthy process that slows things down. If we could have AI do it, blah, blah, blah. I don't know. I guess I want to say something like, we know that, maybe we don't know, but I'll just say, we know that AI can do a variety of things that humans can do, only they can do it way faster. And so if that means that we can either get more done faster or we can get the same amount of done while reducing headcount significantly, then that's a sort of problem to be solved. And so it's clear, there's a clearer path to the ROI on AI.
I have a couple of skeptical responses. So,
Yeah.
one skeptical response is maybe we will see it at the kind of like macro level, so in GDP or other macro level statistics, but we're not yet. So there's still this real puzzle of if AI is making
Yep.
us more productive at the micro level, why aren't we seeing it at the macro level statistics? And there are a few potential explanations. One is this kind of human capital explanation. So people need to be educated about the right ways to use AI and also be willing
Yeah.
to use it. So I think there's a reason, right? A lot of organizations are just setting like very aggressive metrics. You have to use AI a certain amount of times per day or this
Yeah,
many minutes
so
per
dumb.
week. We're not going to train you how to actually use AI. And so
Yeah,
actually
yeah.
without that, we're not actually going to get a productivity boost, right? Then you might say, okay, let's cut the human as much out of the equation as possible. If we can just automate quite a lot, this will give us a kind of productivity boost just by having these capital investments, and we can get rid of the labor component. There, I think there are two questions, right? One is just as a society, how comfortable are we with that? So we might worry we've got these interlocking AI systems that we don't quite understand. There's no human in control of them. And then we might just be quite nervous about things spiraling out of control or the possibility of a kind of system-wide meltdown. I think as well, another problem with automation is unless we're like fundamentally changing how an organization is structured, it's still fitting into these very human patterned ways of working. So what we see, for example, is, people are generating a bunch of content, but it still has to be reviewed by a human, just as you would traditionally,
Sure.
right? Give stuff to your manager. And now we have this term AI slop, which is all of the kind of nonsense
Yeah.
that people are creating with AI very quickly. That's not, in fact, making us more productive. So there's the question of just in virtue of someone producing more stuff, is that actually a kind of quality increase or do we just get more faster?
Yeah. Yeah. So I would think to the GDP point, that's what we should expect given everything that Lauren said about they're not doing change management properly. And so you're not going to see the adoption. And if you don't see the adoption, you're not going to see the impact on GDP or any other sort of macro metrics or something like that. It doesn't indicate to me that jobs are not getting replaced or can't get replaced. It's just that they haven't realized, to your point, Lauren, that they have to engage in this change management stuff and they're just not doing it or they're not doing it well yet. Then to your point, Kate, which was about we haven't seen wholesale new organizations or it's still people. I think that's also part of the problem. Part of what's at stake here is that to what extent can we reimagine what a corporation looks like? Does it have to be that many people? Does it have to be that large? Can there be other ways of putting humans together in a corporate type shape such that it's not 50,000, 100,000 people or something like that? I don't know. The thing that's floating in the back of my head is something like, yeah, look, near term, you're not going to see the kind of change, blah, 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 but you'll see that big displacement 5 years, 10 years from now, as those giant companies figure out how to do that change management or companies are built from the ground up using AI so that displace the behemoth at the moment. And so, yeah, what if I just say something like, you're looking to not far enough into the future?
Yeah, so I think two things. One, absolutely possible. So one way to proceed in this debate is set out that case, set out all of the assumptions that you're making about what kind of steps that Lauren outlined and others actually happened. And then we can have put some probabilities on the likelihood of that occurring.
Yeah.
Then we can have another case where we think, well, maybe people are quite resistant to adopting these technologies. Maybe we get a lot of worker sabotage. Maybe we never get the kind of human capital investment that we needed. Maybe actually these technologies can't replace us in a lot of cognitive tasks and the kind of plausible sounding benchmarks that we put to test these capabilities didn't work. I don't think either Lauren or I would rule that out as a plausible future, but the message is quite a lot of steps need to happen in between here and now. And a kind of helpful thing in outlining those steps is we can think about how likely is it then.
Yeah. So in other words, I'm trying to put on the sort of AI cheerleader's hat here, but you're accusing me in my capacity as AI cheerleader of making the same mistake that we make of individuals. So we say, and I would myself was, when I wasn't wearing my cheerleader hat, making fun of this. Oh my God, look, it passed the bar. Now the law profession is gone. Think about how efficient and what work we can do. And I did the same thing, but at the organizational level just now, which I think you're pointing out. I said something like, imagine what new organizations could be. And yeah, what could they be? And what does that actually look like? And how do we actually get there? What's the probability of actually getting there? 10 years to what? How? What are you talking about? And that seems to be like a fair response.
Yeah, and I think it gets to also the kind of ethical questions that we're all interested in. So, for example, you might take the gig economy as one model of this. You might say, look, in the gig economy, there's a platform, right? There is a company that's managing the matching of workers to particular people with tasks, but there's not a kind of large firm of people doing, say, deliveries or driving cabs, right? Instead, we have Uber, Deliveroo.
Right.
This is quite a different way of chunking up and then parceling out work. But then there's the question of, is this a future we want, where everyone is working in this kind of gig economy way? And what is the technology doing to our kind of human agency, sense of meaning, work, all of these kind of things? So let's say like we could take all of the steps that Lauren has, or Lauren outlined some steps for us. Do we actually want that future?
Yeah, so wait, I really like that comparison with the gig economy stuff, right? So people, on the one hand, at first people thought, ooh, the gig economy, it's freedom. You're not tied down to a particular business or a company or a boss, whatever. You're free to make your own hours, and the harder you work, the more money. There's something romantic about being a hired gun that roams the world. But then it turns out, oh wait, shit, at least in the US, you need health insurance. You need regular work. You need predictable income. And you need sometimes to fight against the corporation that's organizing the gig worker. So whether it's Uber or Lyft or an Upwork or something, they can easily in various ways take advantage of those people because they can start taking a bigger percent of their overall fee or something along those lines, right? So then you want collective rights. And so now you start thinking, oh, okay, so maybe we want some version of the gig economy, but not the free-for-all that we had first envisioned. We need certain kinds of protections for gig workers. I think that's your point. So then my question to you was, and maybe this is for both of you, what does it look like then to implement AI in a way that sort of works with workers, works with employees, so we don't wind up with the worst version of the gig economy, but we wind up with the better version of what's analogous to a good-looking gig economy?
Yeah.
But for the world of AI.
So I think one thing that, connects nicely also with the AR VR case is that kind of like design and rollout by consultation. So in a lot of cases, we see these technology fail because what do doctors need? Maybe doctors need an automatic transcription service for their notes, and that's what would most help doctors be efficient in their workplace. But nobody actually asked doctors. And if they'd asked doctors, would have either designed the technology quite different, or to Lauren's point, right, selected a quite different need or problem to be solved. And so I think in some of these cases, right, no one bothered to actually figure out like what's the precise problem that the technology is going to solve. And if they'd consulted workers and if workers had some kind of say over that, then these technologies would have like genuinely complemented their work rather than make more work for them.
Yeah, that seems okay. So that seems at a high level, right? But the doctor case in particular is a nice example. I'm watching The Pit now, and that's what's going on. And there's one doctor trying to shove generative AI down the throats of everybody else for note taking in particular. But then I guess now this is a question for you, Lauren. How plausible is it to scale those kinds of consultations? So there's one of the appeals of AI is that it's usable in countless contexts, and way more contexts than a foundational model company can manage, right? Or can comprehend. It's used in healthcare, but where in healthcare? There's a billion different roles and a billion different workflows and a billion different within healthcare, and then in insurance, and then in financial services, and then in consumer packaged goods. So there's so many roles, there's so many contexts of use, there's so many workflows that the possibility of consulting all these roles seems like it's in principle like a lovely idea, but in practice, virtually impossible. Are we supposed to rely on intermediary startups to do that work? What would it look like for AI to be developed in consultation with the people who are going to use it at scale?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And it's a valid point that it's the scale and kind of differentiation you have across all of these different workflows, as we talked about earlier, makes it very hard to gather on the ground inputs from everybody. I do think that there's maybe a balance where you aren't going out to everybody, but there's certainly, I think, what can be lacking in the tech processes today of perhaps some companies is that they aren't going on the ground enough to begin with at all. And so I think maybe it's about a balance where you're not going to get everybody, but maybe you can actually have enough of a spread that you can then pull in some real insights that apply more broadly rather than just sitting in a high tower and thinking about what you believe people may need. I think this
Right.
also, maybe Kate has some thoughts on this around like using that kind of research to then form a framework that you then apply around perhaps a value system versus, that is effectively bottoms up built rather than tops down provided.
Okay, so what's the value system or the framework with which these things are going to be developed? And relatedly, can you answer that question without first consulting with the people whom you're going to deploy the AI with, who are going to use the AI? Do you first have to talk with them about what values they want and then feed that back into how you build the system? But it's going to be too late for that. Is that plausible? Or do you think, no, look, there's some universal values that we just need to build into all AI? Doesn't matter what role or who it's going to impact. These are some values that need to just be in there from the ground level. Yeah. Anyway, so how should we think about framework values, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think here there's a real trade-off between just putting in a set of values up front and making these systems really flexible and open source to be customizable by different communities. And so I think the hard thing here is it's really a thing that society, as a society, we ought to be deciding rather than me or any company legislating in particular what approach we ought to take. For example, with generative AI, people have often tried to prompt these systems to get these funny examples of pictures of the Pope as women and all these kind of things.
Sure.
But then you get these allegations like, these companies are so woke. Why can't I generate these sort of images? And there you might think, maybe there's one case to be made. Look, there's just a set of, say, human rights or other kind of protections we need to bake into them. And then from there, they can be used and customized. Or there's another case that's like, look, as long as relevant communities each have the kind of like technological ability to customize and build on these sort of things, kind of plurality of values is what we ought to be seeking. The problem is people don't, in general, have the kind of either knowledge or, importantly, like compute in order to do that. So the problem is we're getting like very few values because we just have very few companies that are actually able to build these systems. So I think there's one kind of question of what is the right set of values, but then there's the other important question, Reed, that you brought up, which I think is the more fundamental question, which is who should decide? Is it just the province of this company? Should governments be legislating these values? And if so, what kind of relevant groups ought to have a say? And there I think it's just going to depend a lot on the extent to which these technologies are really like embedded and shape our day-to-day lives and our institutions in very deep ways. So you might think, look, if we're using AI in healthcare, of course it ought to follow our kind of healthcare norms and values. If we're using AI in finance, it ought to be robust in certain kind of ways. But if we're just using AI to write funny poems and send them to each other, it doesn't really seem to be a kind of important, like, moral weight to this question of, exactly what values is the system using to generate these humorous limericks. So I think the reason why the values problem is so high stakes is the aim was really to like embed generative AI or other AI technologies across all of our basic institutions, and then that's why we get these questions.
Okay, so let me put the skeptic's hat on again. So I want to say something like, we know who's going to decide. Society should decide. Okay, what does that amount to? They're not going to vote. They don't get to tell the developers at a foundation model company, hey, here's the values that we want. That's not going to happen. What will happen is they will make decisions that seem plausibly to get them into the least trouble, so long as that's compatible with more or less maximizing profit. I just don't know it's hard for me to get a grip on, here's what we should do. We should have society decide. What I don't know what that looks like in practice. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm just going to stop there. I don't know what that looks like in practice. And so it's hard for me to sign up for it.
Yeah.
As opposed to, I'll stop. Yeah.
Yeah, I think here a thing that's important to remember is we regulate all sorts of industries. And I think the problem with AI is we're really struggling to think what kind of regulatory paradigms should we apply to AI? But once we figure that out, I think oftentimes we tend to pretend, oh, AI is this new mysterious thing. How on earth could we deal with it? We've got a lot of history of regulating markets, of regulating people's interpersonal behavior with the law. All of that can be brought to bear on AI. So take the EU AI Act. I think a major problem with the EU AI Act is it basically takes this kind of product safety lens. So is this the kind of product that's likely to cause harm to an individual? And if so, then we need to regulate it. And you might think that has really important limitations. For example, it can't help us address all of these kind of questions. What are the kind of risks and benefits of using AI in order to educate students? There we might think there are a lot of kind of values and purposes that education could serve. It's not really a product safety problem. So I think once we get the right kind of regulatory lens, we just use our normal regulatory tools in order to think about how can we incentivize companies and other actors using and developing these technologies to do the right kind of things. I think maybe the final thing to say is people often underestimate the role that governments play in innovation. So the U.S. Defense Department is a major sponsor of self-driving cars and various kinds of innovations relevant to AI. They're setting the priorities. So it's, oh, what can we possibly do? These companies are the ones that always decide these questions. Governments have a huge amount of money to spend on these questions, and they can be setting these research and innovation priorities more directly. And in fact, they are in many cases.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to push back again. So one, regulation is very slow, and maybe even slower than that. So that's one thing. That's if we get them. Of course, the Europe has the EU AI Act. The US has nothing. We don't have data privacy regulations, let alone regulations for AI. The other thing is that I'm not totally convinced that it's just like regulating all the other things. I said this in another discussion that I had, and now I don't remember when. Maybe it's another episode. But when we had to regulate cars, we've been regulating cars for decades, but the car has been basically the same thing for decades. It's a box with 4 wheels that you put people in, and it moves around. And so, yeah, we can figure out, okay, how far can it go with how much power and what does the crumple zone look like and blah, 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 seatbelts. But the fundamentals of it haven't changed so wildly that a whole new regulatory regime needs to erupt. And it doesn't seem like that way with digital technologies. We've got AI now. First, we had traditional machine learning or narrow AI, then generative AI. And of course, the EU AI Act people were scrambling when generative AI came out because they originally wrote it for narrow. And then agentic AI comes onto the scene and they're like, holy shit, what do we do now? There's another beast. So I'm concerned that the regulatory response being the spearhead here is a non-starter because it's just too, even when it does get passed, it's too slow to react to the technology as it evolves. And right now it's AI, agentic AI, and it's going to be the next kind of AI, and then it's going to be maybe quantum or blockchain or stitching together AI and quantum and blockchain solutions. And you know what, for good measure, AI VR solutions. I'm worried about that.
Yeah, me too. For one reason that you might think, so it's puzzling that the EU was kind of wronged by generative AI, because if they'd had any conversation with companies, they could have seen this coming much sooner. So one major problem we see is this kind of brain drain, right? All of the people who could act as expert witnesses on the technologies go to work for industry, not in government. It's very hard to regulate things you don't understand.
Yeah.
So in that case, you might say two things. Okay, maybe if you're a company, you think in these kind of failures of governments to regulate, we're the next best actors. So we have moral responsibilities that we shouldn't have, but we have because there's not a kind of well-functioning government. I think there it's really compelling in the short term, but very worrying in the long term. So it's like continuing to erode governmental capacity over time, and we'll end up in a setting where we just look to companies more and more for our kind of moral advice on these things. Another thing that you can do as a government maybe is say, look, what we really want to do insofar as possible is just to level the playing field between different stakeholders. And then whatever result that we get will be fair because everyone had a kind of equal bargaining power going into this. So to go back to our workplace example, you might say the major problem here is that employers have tons of power, workers have very little bargaining power. And so they can't represent their interests in the kind of deployment or design of these technologies. There's no one right answer, but the problem was this inequality of power. So you might say, maybe there's a worker who's, I want to be in the metaverse. I have some reasons to not want my activity to be constantly recorded, but I have no choice. It's either like hop in or get kicked out of the company. And if there aren't many jobs in their area, they've got very little bargaining power. They just have no kind of standing ability to resist this. So I think one thing that governments could do is like much more, to a much greater degree, just level the playing field across the different actors. And then once the playing field is level, we could have more confidence that whatever outcomes that we end up at, we can't predict what they are, but whatever equilibrium we kind of end in is more fair than it would have been otherwise.
All right, Lauren, in light of all that, the difficulties of regulating in the right kind of way, the difficulties in even creating a government that has the right kind of people, given your experience with VR and now with AI, what do you think now is the best way going forward for how we think about AI augmenting human work, replacing human work, regulations? What should we learn from the VR stuff? And then where do we go now?
Yeah, I would say there are responsibilities across the board. For tech companies who are providing AI, they have a responsibility to do so in a responsible way. What that looks like, we've discussed here, we don't know the answers, right? And we don't know who owns these decisions fully, but there is a responsibility to do this in as responsible way as possible. And so really understanding the industries that you're going into, understanding the work of the people whose lives you're changing through changing their workflows, et cetera. It's important to do that on the ground research in some way. And then for companies themselves who are adopting these technologies, know what you're getting yourselves into, right? Really understand with clarity what is the problem that you're trying to solve and what are the measurable outcomes that you need to see to know that this technology is actually working in the way that you want it to, rather than just adopting something and kind of seeing where it goes. That will lead to both failed pilots and deployments as well as potentially outcomes that you don't want or that you're not looking for. So that. Yeah.
Let me ask you one last thing then. I actually think you kind of sound optimistic about AI's ability to do lots of stuff, because it sounds like your explanation for why we don't see big moves yet is because of the lack of organizational change, a lack of training, a lack of engaging people in the right way, a lack of clearly identifying the problem that you want to solve using AI. But those all seem like very doable things. And so I think, do I hear you right? You're actually more of a long-term optimist because maybe you think that actually these things can be answered. Or maybe you think, no, actually we're probably going to be more in a VR kind of situation where we will find use for AI, but it's going to be in a much narrower band of use cases than we currently imagine.
Yeah, it's what I think Kate was alluding to earlier around it being a spectrum, right? It's like there's the status quo. We aren't necessarily saying we want the status quo. And then there's this future that is this complete transformation that we don't know that we'll get there either. In between, I think exactly what you were just saying is where I sit. I think there are going to be more specific use cases, more specific functions, more specific industries where this technology has more of an impact than others. And so we shouldn't be applying a view of AI broad brush across the board, but rather it should be this targeted perspective. And some areas, I think it will win out. I think other areas, it may not have as much traction. And I think I'm optimistic for a version of this future, but not necessarily optimistic for kind of the full-on transformation. Everybody is replaced. The world looks completely different. Yeah.
And it's just, you have to guess about what those industries are. If I think off the top of my head, I would think, as Kate mentioned, there's coding. So it looks like software development is going to face a pretty big shakeup. And then I could see the creative industry, sort of Hollywood, as the sort of, not LLMs in particular, but more video, audio, visual generative AI. I could see that doing a bunch of stuff. Outside of that, I'm not sure where the massive changes are supposed to be. Do you have any instincts on that or insights on that?
Not really. I think the areas that you've called out, we're already seeing pretty significant change on the coding side today, and it's still early stages. I think the flip side of things that won't be impacted, I think, as much are going to be things that are rooted in the kind of the physical world, right? And certainly you can get into the topic of kind of robotics, et cetera, so that further down the line. But things like, supply chain manufacturing, there are AI use cases that can come in and impact aspects of that. But in terms of kind of this full-on broad-scale change, I think maybe my bet would be not on those and more on some of these more kind of digital type practices.
Super interesting. All right, this has been great, and I hope that you're both right. I think you are, and I hope you are. So that's good. Usually these podcast episodes end with doom and gloom, but I see there's good reason for optimism. So thank you both for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us. It's great to meet you.
You too. Thanks everyone for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.